It is such a pleasure to be able to talk to Rachel Montgomery today. It is always so nice to see you. And I know that we had a brief moment of seeing each other in person in Chicago at the Heartwood conference at Northwestern. And that was very powerful. And I really appreciated your insights and the way you speak. And, you remind me of someone who has this very level-headed way of saying things that are sort of devastating, right? Like when you kind of say it calmly, but behind the words are these just images of things that you've been through and what you've been up against. And so I want people to see your strength in that and also really hear your words, the gravity of the story. And so it's a nice combination to be able to have that. And I'm sure it's also good for yourself to keep yourself calmer as you're talking about these things. But I would love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself and then we'll start talking.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, it's great to see you. Always great to see you. For introductions, let's see, what hat am I going to wear today? I live in the Seattle area and I identify myself as a cult survivor and someone who also experienced a cult situation in a Buddhist context. And often I identify myself also as a survivor of sexual abuse in that context as well. So that's how I like to identify myself in this space. And I'm comfortable with survivor or victim. And it's how I orient myself in these opportunities to talk about my experience is to put myself there. But outside of that, I'm a cat mom and a dedicated spouse, and right now, avid weed puller. I'm trying to get my garden beds ready for the fall.
A weed puller. I love that. That's so interesting. I mean, I love that you have this other life too, right? Not just as a survivor or victim. It's good that you are highlighting the fact that terminology is, I think, and should be a very personal decision. And that you get to have this other life. You get to be a cat mom and a partner and a weed puller. And I recently spoke with Carol Murchison, the attorney who represented you, who's now kind of a friend to all, which is really quite lovely. And it's an interesting visual because I sort of see her as a weed puller, right? I mean, I see her as someone who kind of comes through and is like, nope, nope, can't do that anymore. No, gotta go. To make space for things that are healthy and healthier and that can help people flourish. And it's a very interesting metaphor. So I think it's great to be able to talk about the fact that you have a life now, and it sounds really nice. And if we can, because I certainly want to get to the lawsuit, the complaint, what happened to you, I have a lot of reactions to the whole scene that played out that became part of the lawsuit that really happened to you in real time and was devastating and confusing, I'm sure, at the time. So tell us a little bit about what brought you into kind of searching for this spiritual path and also then finding this center.
Great question. Thanks, Rachel. That's a great place to start. I was a young adult when I had a close friend who had joined a Buddhist community as an employee of that community. And I had been invited to go and visit her for quite a long time. And just circumstantially, it hadn't worked out. But I finally made it up for a 4th of July celebration, which is a really unique time to be at a cult for a celebration because cults are already high energy. And then it's really high energy when there's some sort of event. And so I would say, it started with a very enchanting, holiday-oriented experience. So lots of people, lots of positive socializing, positive interactions, food, fireworks, a really fun introductory experience to this community. And it was on such a positive note that I started the experience that I was then asked if I'd be willing to consider working there for the remainder of the summer. And it felt like something I couldn't pass up. I was young, grew up my entire life in one semi-rural place in rural Washington state. And I was always intrigued by the big city or other people's life experiences and other sorts of people, having not grown up with exposure to much beyond my little world. It was just really exciting, mentally exciting to think about, meeting these new people, getting to know them better. And I wasn't attracted with the intent to convert to the religion. But as we know how cults work, I did quickly get swept in the belief system. I was converted by August. So it
Oh,
was
wow.
pretty quick.
Wow. And so what does that mean to be converted in this context?
Ooh, good question. Well, I was raised in a more Christian, Protestant type household upbringing, and I felt, a lazy Christian or an unengaged Christian as I got older. I went into college, and I wasn't focused on any sort of faith or religious aspect to my life at the time. But I still felt like if someone were to ask me on the street, I would say that I was a Christian. So it was a bit of a process for me to learn the faith and belief system of the place I was living. And one of the sort of, I don't know to say it's a requirement, but one of the aspects of the experience, this immersive experience of working there, was to get a daily lesson in their belief system. And the lessons, which one a day, sort of culminated to me having a change of heart, a change of thought about their belief system, my own lukewarm belief system, and deciding to go through the ritual practices to take on and go into their belief system was how that transitioned.
Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Right. So I think just getting to that space so soon says a lot about being open to it, but also the system itself and how it really kind of drives that engine. And I wonder also, just in terms of the community, how much being a part of a community played part in this.
I've had to think about that a lot, because the question of, would I have stayed in the faith without the community? Or did I leave the faith because of the experiences I had around the faith? Trying to decipher for myself years later where I landed in my willingness to stay engaged in the religion or the specific flavor of religion that they were offering. And I think the community was the primary pull factor, because they modeled such loving and warm behaviors that were really attractive. And I think that's not all that dissimilar from what is talked about in Christianity, where you go out into the world and there's language around emulating, Christ-like behaviors and being a positive influence on others and living closely day by day, summer camp style. So 24/7 with a lot of adults that are modeling really positive, attractive behaviors, people you want to be around, people that make you feel good when you're around them. Yeah, that would make me think whatever they're believing in, I would want to believe in too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think living communally, having that, the 24/7-ness of it, the fun, the connection, it does breed a lot of closeness and specialness. And it's something then you don't want to leave. And in fact, even when people go to summer camp, and I know that from my own experience, just coming home from that, you fall into you feel down. You're coming off of a high and you don't want it to end. And that's often why there are a lot of tears the last night or two, because you anticipate that it's going to be hard. So I think you try to sustain that as much as possible in your life. And not a lot of adults get to experience it. So when it's there, I'm sure it feels just very nice to be a part of something. So I wonder also, when you were saying this flavor, that was an interesting distinction. So I know that with so many different religious movements, they are going to have their own take on it. And so from what you understand about this particular group, and now we'll talk about this particular group for a little bit before we get to the experience, what was it and what was its flavor?
At the time to give context, when I was first oriented to the community, I didn't have any previous data points for Buddhism. So this was my first exposure to Buddhism. And so I really didn't know what Buddhism was or had any way to discern if this is standard Buddhism or if this is an offshoot of any sort of standard. But afterwards, and trying to make sense of the experience, is where I learned much more about Buddhism as a whole, different aspects and flavors that the religion takes. And I'll say for myself, through that experience, I learned how peculiar I think this particular flavor may have been. And to say, when adults isolate themselves geographically, information wise, like when you limit your intake of outside influences and you isolate geographically in like an off the grid type dynamic that's led by one person, it makes sense it would start to form its own unique characteristics. I mean, it's like its own little petri dish. And so without those influences, it really turned into, I think, maybe more of its own thing. So I've had to do more to educate myself on what was like the local flavor of the religion versus Buddhism in a broader context, and where they have similarities and where they don't, where they're different. And for the particular community I was in, it falls under the umbrella of like guru student type Buddhism. So having a dynamic where there's a guru and a student relationship, and that's really the centerpiece, focus point of how you operationalize the faith.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I love the idea of a petri dish. It's like learning about different animals that live on different continents. And you're like, kangaroos. How did that
It's
happen?
feeling like a platypus. Yeah.
Like a platypus. Right. So I think it is so interesting that when people get involved in these kinds of fringe organizations, that they are then exposed to this. And if you don't have a frame of reference, you might not know how unusual it is, but you also might not know how wrong it is. Right? I think that plays a big part in this scene as we're about to unfold it. Yeah. Okay. So tell me about your impressions when you first got there and your impression of the leader. Let's talk a little bit about him.
Well, I've said this before, and it really is true. Like when I was a young adult, I was really naive to the idea that people could have intentions that were malicious towards a person and that you couldn't tell it on the offset. I really had like a more Disney type thought that the villain is like a really visible, like, it's really in your face who the bad guy is, so to speak.
Right.
So going into the community, first I assumed that no one would have any sort of ulterior motives or malicious intents, that everyone there was a good, healthy, safe person, especially because it's a religious environment. That was another assumption I carried.
Sure.
And truly everyone was wonderful. So my experience was these are really wonderful, enjoyable, safe people to be around. The teacher initially was very peripheral. In the specific community I was in, the center, the close circle of the teachers who has the most exposure to them and their behaviors and their habits. And the further you are from that sort of close knit around the teacher community, the less you get to know the spectrum of that person. It's much more of a facade of the person the further you get from that inner circle. So my initial impressions of the teacher were very much like a performative type, curated, I would say, persona that person put out in the community. Of course, as you get closer into the inner circle, although I'll argue it's pretty abrupt where you go from peripheral to knowing their true behavior, it feels like quite a big sudden shift. But initially, yeah, I just saw a really shiny version of that person's curated persona.
Right. And so I think seeing also how people are responding to someone is something that can really affect your feeling about this person, or if this person has a certain mystique because people just are so enamored with them. If people seem to have love for this person, then you will think they're worthy of that. And as opposed to sometimes people really have that feeling towards a person who is in charge rather than that person really deserving it. So it sometimes can play with your head in those moments of adoration. And so, how much did that play a part in how you saw other people responding to him?
Huge. I'm so glad you brought this up because that's probably primary to my story, because
Okay.
I came in very skeptical that this person might be I mean, thoughts I had is like, is this person a fraud? Are they a buffoon? Because
Yeah.
they're so strange. You know, I'm not accustomed to seeing someone that has aloof behaviors, that wears a spiritual wardrobe, so has clothes and adornments that are unique and not in a way that you can relate to. So being on a throne, having different clothes, behaving in ways that are maybe more unusual or outside of the standard of what you would normally see. And at first was just, I took it with like an open mind of like, this is different. But I will admit that I had little thoughts of like, this is a little strange. Like, is this person really an enlightened being on a throne? Like, is that really true? Or is this sort of an idea that, or a metaphor that's gotten out of hand?
Mm-hmm.
That was like my first couple weeks, is just living in this, like, I didn't commit to any thought, but I had many thoughts that fluttered
Mm-hmm.
through my mind. But I did see that people that are highly educated, very intelligent, doctors, lawyers, were very committed to this person, like you're talking about, just
Mm-hmm.
showering them in appreciation and affection. And I had the thought of, well, if all of these really intelligent adults have this sense of this person, then I'm more inclined to think what they think than but the little, negative, doubtful thoughts that were fluttering in and out.
Right. Right. You can feel, I think, in those moments, like there would be something wrong with you and your thinking if you saw him suspiciously or if you looked down on him and you didn't see him the same way. Yeah, we attribute a lot when we see people who we respect respecting somebody else. And so, yes, it is very motivational in terms of developing our own feelings, but also, and I'm so glad you brought this up, also ignoring those moments where you're thinking, really? Him? And because those, after a while, go away and you don't have them as a guide anymore until they start to come back, until you're starting to see things and you're like, this is what I was thinking. That got very quiet for a long stretch of time. And so, what else were you wondering, even in tiny little moments? Were there things happening that were giving you pause, making you really doubt or wonder or be worried about being there?
That's such a good question. I don't know if anyone's ever asked me that. Thinking back, there were several things that were off putting that I tried to consider that it was because I had no exposure to this type of religious landscape. So I remember being really surprised when folks would bow all the way to their stomach. It could be in
Mm,
gravel, it could be in dirt, it could be, so not necessarily like a pleasant foundation to lay your
right.
body on. Or thinking, oh, really? I even seen a pregnant person like go like on their belly on the gravel. It's like, wow, like we're really committed to this.
Right. Oh,
Like,
yeah.
I don't know if I felt like initially I thought, is that a healthy behavior to have? That kind of like the person comes into eyesight and, you're bowing to the person, felt peculiar. And growing up more Protestant Christian, it's really ingrained that you don't bow to men. It's like as a concept.
Yeah.
So that was initially pretty tough. And then to see that he was unquestioned was also,
Mm,
another pause. Like the dynamic wasn't one that was collaborative or back and forth. It was really like a one-way communication style. And seeing that initially was, again, I was just trying to adjust, like, is the faith, this is the religion. And the charms of it, the silver lining story of it is you have this one person who's supposedly dedicated their entire lives to being your spiritual support, your life support. And so I was trying to understand that that's the context. That's how I was sort of starting
mm.
to acclimate myself to those things that I initially, my knee jerk reaction was, this is outside of my comfort zone.
Oh, it's so interesting. Going back to this visual of this pregnant person going all the way down and laying on her belly on whatever ground she was on. I think about what kind of personality would be okay with that or would demand it. I mean, I think about how uncomfortable I am when a group of people are singing happy birthday to me. Like, I don't know what to do with myself, right?
Oh, relatable.
Oh, God, I
Yeah.
wish this song were shorter. But it is Yes, a very different persona who expects that, who would demand it, or might even punish people for not doing it. But to have someone really put their health at risk and smushing a pregnant belly onto a hard surface.
And
Wow.
maybe they had modified it, but in the moment, it was just, perhaps physically they did some sort of modification I'm sure they did to protect themselves. But
I hope,
just to see that regardless of, it was on gravel. I have the visual, but there's a chance that they modified their body to make it appropriate for them, I'm sure. But still just the action of it in the setting it was in, just that there's no circumstance in which you wouldn't is interesting.
Right.
That it's that level of obligatory.
Right. And the non-questioning. So if there were things that you disagreed with, or if there are things that didn't quite come together, typically there are going to be contradictions and other things that people are going to try to make sense of things. If they're trying to apply logic to a spiritual system like this, it doesn't sometimes fit. And so you got the impression, or maybe the clear message, that you couldn't ask or you couldn't disagree. How was that transmitted?
I don't remember that I couldn't disagree or ask questions. I'll say that when it came to talking about the religion, I could ask questions and I could disagree. And I think folks took it as an opportunity to help me see things the way they would need me to see things. But just me as a person, I wouldn't be in the position to question a person's individual choice. So if I saw someone doing something like prostrations in the gravel, or I'm seeing like, okay, that's their personal way that they're doing their belief system. Who am I to ask? Like, are you? So I didn't ever take the approach to question somebody's personal spaces, but I would ask about the religion and my daily lessons that I received. That would be a chance for me to ask questions and debate sometimes with people about what they were sharing about their religion. And I think that was received positively and then sort of used to support me and to advance my thinking more in their direction. And then also maybe seen as a little humorous because I'm very young. I'm this young female in this community who's got, a bug in her bonnet or bee in her bonnet a couple times to say, I understand this. And they found that I understood it to be, it was fun banter to try and identify our differences and help me come to different conclusions.
Got you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to be able to move into what happened and what was part of the lawsuit and that whole process. I know that does mean delving into something that's hard to delve into, that's emotional. So I'm hoping it feels okay to talk about it. And I guess I want people to understand what was starting to develop there in terms of your closeness with the leader and what became, I think, more intimate emotionally that then he took advantage of.
Well, how it scaffolded was I warmed into the faith and then I became a practitioner of the faith and attempting to follow the practices of everyone else. A little different, I'll say, like as a asterisk to this is I was working at the facility as working for the people there. So a little different than being there as a student or being there with like the sole purpose is I'm dedicated to faith. So I was a little removed from some of the more social aspects to the practice and a little isolated from even their own unique flavor of the religion. So I had those small lessons from people, but I wasn't often included in large lecture formats or teaching formats because my position there was as an employee. So I continued to practice, and those conditions I just described as like I was there as an employee, I didn't have access to these group learning environments in the same way other people did, were later what was exploited as I had more of a one-on-one structure of the religion. So the way I ended up learning and growing in the faith was just with the guru. I was set into this sort of isolated way of learning and practicing the religion and getting feedback on the religion. And it's that dynamic that was exploited for me to experience circumstances of severe harm, which I'm comfortable talking about today.
You are? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know that. And I think also to clarify, when you say that you were working there, I'm thinking that I remember this in reading some of the details that you were working for free, or I don't know if you were getting paid or not, or if it was expected, like a bartering kind of for being there that you were working.
Oh, that was an element for sure, that you would have the good karma, the good fortune to get to be there in and of
Mhm.
itself as part of the pay package. But I did have a stipend that, for a young person, late teens, early 20s, your sense of what time is worth is a little bit different when you get older.
Mhm.
So you're willing to work for a lot less, especially in a summer camp type environment. And then
Mhm.
it did include room
Mhm.
and board. So circumstantially,
Oh.
I had access to be there and to get fully fed there and to have a place to sleep there in order to work
Mhm.
there. And it was expensive to be there as a student, I'll say.
Mhm.
To pay for all of those things on your own would be really cost prohibitive. And so this was, as I continued to come back, really one of the only ways in which I could continue in that community would be to be there in an employee type capacity.
Got you.
Mm.
Okay, and where was this community?
It's still there. It's outside of Eugene, Oregon, rural
Mm.
Oregon. I know
Mhm.
Oregon. Sorry,
Mhm.
Oregon.
Yes. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Yes. Just
Yeah.
there is. Uh-huh. Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
Sorry, state of Oregon, but it is what it is. Right, okay, and it's still there. Interesting. So you were saying that your avenue towards more learning and understanding and connection to the community was specifically with time spent with the leader on your own.
That's what it evolved to. So I did get the opportunity, is how it would have been put, to get more one-on-one teachings with the teacher and their dedicated time to helping me in the context of I'm not in the community as a student, so I don't have access to the
Mhm,
larger group teachings in those learning environments. And so
mhm,
customized learning experiences would have to be generated for me,
mhm,
and they were customized in a way that was certainly exploitive. But as a young person, and someone in that committed and in that community, it was just, I perceived it as just such a wonderful, fortunate opportunity that I could get
mhm, mhm,
teachings directly from the primary deliverer of the teachings in that community. I mean, you could receive teachings from a senior student or from a monastic, but the person that is there to really transmit the material
mhm.
is the guru. Yeah.
Okay, got you. And did you feel comfortable in his presence even before things started, or was there something kind of odd feeling about being with him?
I think it's strange to be around a person that's so powerful. I mean, just in
Um,
general, it's
mhm,
peculiar when when there's such obedience to that person and there's such high
mhm,
esteem for that person. Being people traveling across the world to come and, be at the feet of this person. It's different than being around someone that doesn't have that
yeah,
status. Yeah.
yeah. Right,
Mhm.
okay. Okay. So let's talk about what started to happen and then eventually what did happen that became the reason for the lawsuit, even though I'm sure there were many reasons, but the focus point of it.
The focus point is, and this would be contested, like the organization wouldn't agree to my narrative, but I did have these one-on-one teachings with the teacher. And the teacher explained in those teachings that I had certain negative karma or baggage because I didn't have the karma to be there as a student. So, like karmically, I didn't have the student status as there as in police. So, like maybe lower karmically in my opportunity. And
Mhm.
I had a background as a Christian, which was, he explained to me, was like a deficit against my ability to understand and absorb the teaching. So, I went into these one on one teachings with being made aware that I was starting lower than other people. And so,
Mm.
as a competitive person, it's possible this was something that progressed over a few years. So, I'd been in the community already a couple of years before these one on one teachings started. And this narrative that he presented was presented to me. It's quite possible he'd observed that I'm a fairly competitive person and I want to have a standard of excellence for everything I do. And So maybe there was intentionality between positioning those one-on-one teachings as I'm in a deficit and I need to catch up to my peers. And here's the opportunity to catch up and to catch up more quickly. So the first task I was given that was part of this opportunity was to do certain practices in order to have the karma necessary to clean and maintain sacred objects. So sacred objects they're common, I guess, maybe in all religions, where some objects have special significance. In Buddhism, the significance of those objects and maintaining, touching, cleaning those objects would require you to maintain certain standards of behavior and have certain levels of teaching or permissions to be able to do those sorts of activities. So I was given this opportunity for this job, but to meet that opportunity, it's also karmically good to get to touch all those sacred objects. So it's a positive feedback loop, that opportunity. I would do better in my practice and then get more enhanced in my practice as a result of this opportunity. The entry point into that positive feedback loop was these one-on-one teachings, which started out, I'd say, standard lecture style teachings and progressed into me performing physical acts on his body and him performing physical acts on my body of a sexual nature that were described as not a sexual nature.
And how were they described?
They were described as, and this is sort of a flavor in Buddhism where there's this possibility to have a tantric practice. So to use your body to advance your path to enlightenment, to sort of enhance or catapult you further into your practice. I understand, and I did understand from that community, that tantric practice is something that's for more advanced students. There's actually transparency there. That's not something that you start out with on day one. So for folks that aren't familiar with tantric practice, I'm not a subject matter expert on it, but if it's easy to find information on what it is. But it does involve the body and sexual type behaviors that are not framed as sexual behaviors. And so it would make sense that you don't start day one in those practices. You get warmed up to them, you advance towards them in your practice. But the teacher told me that I was special. Here we go, a broken record, right? Everyone has this story. I was special. He let me know we actually knew each other in a past life. And we had all these connections that he hadn't disclosed earlier, but he felt like now was the right time to let me know. And so I actually had this opportunity to have this special relationship where I could advance in Buddhism more quickly with him. So having someone that's a celebrity status, and then having someone that at that point, my thinking was that he was an enlightened being, like I had evolved in my thinking in the context of that community, to see him as an enlightened being, to see him as a Buddha, which is what you're instructed to do there, as a goal. And because I'm competitive and goal-oriented, I got to that goal. And so, I was in this position of thinking everything he said or did is for my benefit and the benefit of all beings. That's sort of the catchphrase around this person's behavior. And so anything they would suggest, this teacher would suggest, I would follow for the benefit of myself and for the benefit of all beings. And that included these behaviors that are of a sexual nature that were framed to me as something I would do while following visualization practices, which are pretty cornerstone in Buddhism meditation. Follow these visualization practices while things are happening to my body, and I'm being instructed to do things with someone's body, essentially being put into like a disassociated state.
And so when you were doing these things, and you can describe them or not, that I'll leave that up to you, but I'm wondering if there was a part of you that would go in and out of a dissociative state, wondering if this was right.
Well, I think adrenaline is such a funny thing because I do remember having adrenaline, and I didn't let myself associate it with fear, but more with, like, I would say not excitement per se, but like a type of me trying to channel those feelings, that the elevated physical state, into a state of being grateful, of feeling like I am achieving these goals, somewhere like an ambition-oriented mindset. And that's how I transformed them for myself. Of course, though, I look back and was very much just afraid, but I didn't have the permissions in my mind anymore to articulate it in that way. was very strong in the context of the flavor of the religion I had there, that negative thinking was always something to avoid. It was described as there's 5 types of positive thinking and 5 types of negative thinking. So now this is going to start to sound really culty, but all of your thoughts can be distilled into 10 types of thinking, right? Like it can be that simple.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have negative thinking, it's cultivating negative karma for you. And because I'm in this religious state doing religious visualizations, I'm really it's trying to cultivate positive thinking. And there's no allowance in my mind to have anything negative.
Okay. There are these stories that I hear a lot, and that we also hear here on the podcast about how people are disarmed, how people are kept from responding, from having a certain feeling that is commensurate with what's happening to them. And it keeps them from being clear about the fact that what's happening to them is wrong, or that they can be upset about it. And it feels like then it is like a perpetrator's playground if you can make sure that other people can't get upset about what it is that you're doing to them. If you have that part of your personality that wants to do things to people that they shouldn't be doing. Not everyone takes advantage of that, but in these situations, someone does. I think also that there is this idea that you were supposed to have gratitude, this idea of reciprocity, that here they're giving you something, you're coming from a lowly place, and so you should feel like this is a gift and be appreciative of it, even though I'm sure you were working for very little, working a lot, I can only imagine. And they should be having gratitude towards you. I mean, it should be reversed. But I know in the context of these groups, it doesn't really play out that way. And so I think you're just also not supposed to be negative, because you're supposed to be feeling like, they're willing to do all these things for me, even though I didn't deserve it. What do you think?
And I think what's complicated for me, and I was describing this actually at the conference we were at in Chicago with someone, is the community I happened into was one that was really positive towards me. I felt like family. I felt really welcomed and brought in, and really showered with appreciation, affection, friendship. I felt like a cherished member of a community, I guess I'll say.
Mm-hmm.
I did feel like they were grateful to me and grateful for what I offered. The narrative that the teacher was presenting felt actually not quite in line with how I experienced the community, but more, I think I'm realizing for the first time in having this conversation, the complexity of it too is that I was thinking that participating, this is like, negative side of my personality, not really, I don't mean it that way, but like I was really trying to be advanced. Like, so
Yeah.
I wasn't in a state of being like subservient as much as I was in a state of like, it really hit the right buttons to tell me that I was behind everybody else and I could get ahead and I could even get further. And that really struck the right chord for me. I'm realizing for the first time in this conversation, like that really set me up to be fully committed to those situations that were adrenaline oriented and really charged with a lot of feelings, but forced to maintain it in a positive sense. But I had this opportunity that no one else would have, and that I could lean into being able to think of myself as special, like that maybe that was something I wanted to hear. And I felt like I didn't want to let go of this new perception of myself as a special person. Those are the type of things that were weaponized against me in that dynamic that maybe are embarrassing to admit that I wanted so badly to feel special, but it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, still, no matter your motivation, no matter what you were trying to heal, no matter what you were trying to feel, no matter what kind of advancement you were trying to go for, it's still the teacher's responsibility to uphold boundaries. It's still the teacher's responsibility to say, no, I'm not going to do that to you, to someone who trusts me. no matter why you're in the room. And so I think it's just good to be clear about that as you talk about it, even in your own mind. Think
Yeah.
about these people, like it's a misnomer. And I was talking about this on the podcast before, like, where they say that women slept their way to the top. Well, no, they didn't really. I mean, they didn't. It was just that the men, or sometimes women too, but more often men who were in charge, withheld things from them until they got these favors, until they got access to their body. So it's not, even if the woman wanted to get ahead, still she was put in this situation of this is the only way to do it, you know?
The only way to do it. And that is for the benefit of all beings to accomplish it. I mean, it's thinking like, what are you sleeping your way to the top to? I mean, I know I'm saying that like callously. I don't mean it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm
But
sort
it's
of
the expression that's used, right? Yeah.
completely.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, obviously the dynamics were so specifically religious. So I didn't identify them in the context that was happening as something that was sexual even, but the top, like what was the top was for me just to become an enlightened human so I could be a better benefit to all of humanity and all living beings. It's a fake top. I mean, that's not, I believe now that's not real. And you don't obtain that through those types of behaviors. But at the time, that was the only playbook I had, was that the only way for me to become a better person was to be enlightened. And this was offered to me as the only way I could do that.
Wow. Okay. Right. And that's not on you. That's not your fault.
Yeah.
Right. So going into the scene that I know from the case, but I'm sure there are other scenes too. There's so much about it. And then I also want to get to just the court process and then finishing up. I know that we could talk for hours, but just in the essence of time to move this forward. There's something about sort of reading about how it all went down to whatever, limited detail I have. But I would like for you to talk about it, and then I'll jump in to give my assessment.
Okay. Well, so I think it was probably the best and worst thing that could have ever happened to me in the context of that community. So I had been for a few months working off of this new practice where I would do visualizations and have things happen to my body, and or be instructed to do things to my teacher's body. And it was all done in this state of visualizing certain deities or certain aspects of deities. So it was really just in my head for those experiences. And a lot of things happened to my body for those times. And I was instructed to do different things to this person's body in those times. And those I could all contextualize within what felt like the flavor of the religion. Like I'd been in the religion for a couple of years, I'd been in the community for a couple of years, and I did understand these were part of the community, but I was put into this state of secrecy. So, sort of before I could initiate these teachings with the teacher, I was sworn into what's referred to as a Vajra promise in the context of this religion, where you keep something between you and the teacher, and it's an unbreakable promise. So it has really severe consequences. I mean, we think the Christian hell is scary. Well, I mean, this is like Christian hell times two. I mean, the consequences are really severe, which I don't think a lot of people think about when they think of Buddhism. So it's just sort of interesting. And also, it's not one of the things that's brought up a lot. Someone could go to Hogwarts and never learn about Horcruxes, for example. Like you could be a Buddhism for a long time and no one brings up the Vajra promise because it's sort of one of those, small peripheral aspects from where you're at and where you are in the lineage of Buddhism. And so I was in the context of having these things experienced as part of my religion. I couldn't share it with anyone. I was under this Vajra promise. That was the prerequisite to those teachings. And then I found myself in a situation where something broke outside of that container that I was trying really hard to stay engaged in. So during this time where these things are happening to my body and vice versa, I'm getting rashes, I'm getting health problems, I'm having joint pain. My body was doing all the things that people say where your body is saying no for you, but my brain wasn't warmed up to the idea. But the thing that broke the camel's back, so cumulatively, I don't know whether or not I've ever left the community or just continued to live in that state, which I know a lot of people there do live in that state. So it's quite possible I could still be there today. Something that broke out of that mold is I was forced into a state of intoxication. So I was forced by the teacher to drink a large volume of wine on a certain social gathering. And while I was actually unconscious, he raped my body. And the consequence of that was I became pregnant. So the context for that outcome is that in order to receive these teachings and to work closely with him, he required that he track my cycle. So he was aware of my cycle.
Wow.
And after that was another prerequisite of being able to participate in these teachings was he knows my cycle and can track my cycle. And after this event, I was treated a little differently. I shortly found out I was pregnant. And then the teacher, after I found out I was pregnant and I came to the teacher, admitted that I was pregnant and it was my destiny to have his child. So I often refer to it as being intentionally impregnated because to me, that's the circumstance of what happened to me. And then post, what happened next is that I panicked and articulated that I actually didn't, that wasn't what I wanted. So I had the courage to articulate that this was a bit of a shock because I had only very small glimpses of not being able to move my body, but being awake during the moment. So I was aware that it had happened, but was aware that I was unconscious. So I started having lots of questions that were unanswerable, especially unanswerable because I couldn't talk to anybody about it. So I was Googling things about, circumstantially, like, can a teacher do something to your body unconsciously and it's still to the benefit of all beings? And trying to wrap my head around the circumstances very naively, thinking like the answer's out there in some scripture, Buddhist scripture, I just don't have it, top of mind or at my fingertips, but I can find the answers. But those questions culminated as well as I decided to have an abortion, which the teacher was willing to pay for under the promise that I would get pregnant again in the future with his child, because this was my destiny. I didn't think my time horizon was shortening during this time, like living in this state, I couldn't see past tomorrow. So I committed to that promise that I would in the future, really not being able to see past, the same day. So I did go forward with the abortion, which was a huge challenge for me personally. And then those questions, like the ones I kind of glimpsed at, like being unclear on how it's a teaching if I'm unconscious and I can't have those visualizations, and being unclear of like how being impregnated unintentionally or against your knowledge could be to your benefit, just trying to untangle the complexities of what I felt was a really complex teaching. Like, whoa, this is a really complicated teaching. There's a lot I got to figure out here, not finding answers. And that boiled over to me spilling the truth of what had happened to me to people in the inner circle of that community where I was now in that inner circle. And that resulted in me being excommunicated.
Which is often how it goes, and which is incredible. I mean, it's adding insult to injury in literally very often. The people in the community, how did they respond to you when you told them?
Aggressively. I became a virus or a cancer almost immediately. And I was so confused because I was just asking clarifications on the teachings. That's how it felt to me. Like I was just, I didn't have any intention of wanting to leave the community or wanting to leave the practice, or at the time that wasn't in my thinking, but they took it as my perception is they took it really aggressively, which then resulted in, very severe excommunication. So I found out later, folks were told that if they talked to me, their marriages would fall apart or they would get gravely ill, or which I didn't know any of that at the time, but that was what folks were told if they were to talk to me.
Yeah. To become a pariah after what you've been through and to try to make sense of it. We will do that if we are thoughtful people. We'll assume there's some greater reason for this. And so we will want to understand what the thinking was, as opposed to here's someone who took advantage of his power and raped me.
Yeah, that wouldn't have even been in my mental possibility to fathom.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I say that not just hearing the story. This is from someone on the outside. That is how it sounds. But within the context of it, it's going to be very confusing. And there are parts of the story, also this idea that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in how I'm remembering it, but just being sort of waking up and being left with no clothing on from the waist down, just like it feels discarded, that you were just left there. And so if this was supposed to be this romantic thing, someone's tracking your cycle and they want you to be the mother of their child, it would seem to me like they'd be treating you not like, okay, now I'm done with doing this thing to her body and I'm just going to leave her on the floor, you know?
Yeah,
Mm.
so the complexity of what happened that isn't very public per se, because I don't know if it's been talked about, I don't know how much it's included in the filings for the lawsuit, is I'm aware of multiple children that he has, and these are not children he's claimed or had any parental connection to.
Mm.
I'm also aware of another rape where he tried to impregnate someone unsuccessfully earlier on in his life through force. I
Mhm.
was an example of intoxication where it couldn't be a cousin or where or refused, but
Mhm.
earlier on in his experience there. So I hate to deduce it this way, but I think he's an individual that I would just say has a breeding kink. I think it's a
Mhm.
sexual fetish because it's
Mhm.
too many people. And then there isn't this post care for having a
Mhm.
parental role or even acknowledging that the child is their offspring. To my knowledge, he will often say it that it's not his offspring, even though it looks like him. So, for whatever reason, to me, the cards point that he has a breeding fetish.
Mhm.
So, it's a sexual fetish behavior, which is
Mhm.
really bizarre to realize about a person. But
Yeah.
for me, that's what all the signs point to.
Okay. Okay. And what I think is also interesting too is the narcissistic part of it, the entitled part of it that kept coming through as I was hearing your story. And going back to this kink, as you call it, because yeah, it all ties together as you describe it, that he'd be willing to pay for the abortion if, like, it had conditions, right? Which is so wrong. No, I mean, if it's something he did too, and he needs to take responsibility for all parts of it, but he'd be willing to do it if you don't tell anyone, which means he knows that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And also, if you promise to father a child of his in the future, as you were talking about. So, back to this idea that's in his mind that this is something you need to do or that you owe him, which is not how, getting pregnant should be, right? That it isn't also part of your bartering for services, this child. But I do think there's so much that it speaks volumes about him in these conditions. Don't tell anyone, because if he was proud of it and if he thought it's okay, why not be able to tell everyone? And if he knew it was kosher, so to speak, if you can use that word for in this context, and that you still needed to give him a child in the future. Really? This person? After he's done this to you. So that there was no sense that what he did was took advantage of your trust and what he did was wrong. I don't see that in here. I'm not sure if that came through anywhere.
Well, and just every time I hear it come out of my own mouth, it's like, wow, like in these cult dynamics, reality really it stretches to the limits. I mean, it can turn into anything, but it can turn into something really grave. I mean, where people will end their own lives because their reality is shifted in such a way, or in this case, I don't know what reality he lives in, but in a reality where he does this to a person, a young woman, and a reality where I assumed I took the same assumption I had of the reality I was in, which is it was to my benefit. I need to figure out exactly how, but it had to have been such a wild reality to be in.
Yes. And the idea that we often will try to make sense of things that don't make sense often makes it easier for the perpetrator. That,
Totally.
right? We have
Yeah.
this cognitive dissonance. We need to find the innocence in it. We need to find the meaning in it. Or what does that mean if there isn't any? And sometimes we'll find it. We'll be searching so hard that we'll just have to, our heart will need to find it.
Yeah. I understand people do that in all sorts of relationships. And when you have a relationship like a guru, your entire current life and future afterlives all depend on this one relationship. So the extent to which you will go to justify every behavior is extreme because the consequences are so dire if you don't figure it out.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so here you are with this situation. And then
Yeah.
how did you get yourself together enough to be just even thinking about pursuing this legally and finding Carol and all of that?
I just feel really fortunate because myself at the time, for whatever reason, I mentioned I didn't respond positively to the abortion. I had told the
Mm,
teacher that one of the reasons I wanted the abortion was because I felt so young and I had felt so like, I understand this is my destiny, living in that reality. My answer is, I'm grateful this is my destiny. And I really had this dream of my life that was different. And the dream I said was I had this dream to do graduate school. I had a dream to join the Peace Corps. And so, for whatever reason, I had experienced sort of an emotional aftermath from the abortion. So, I guess I characterize it as like a depression.
mm,
And the way I pulled myself out of that was working day and night on a Peace Corps application.
huh.
So, I justified to myself that I had made this decision to not pursue this destiny because I had said I had alternative things I wanted to have
Mm,
be part of my
mm,
story before
mhm,
I've met that destiny. I know that's also crazy to say, but I'm speaking from how I was thinking about it at the
yeah.
time. And
Mhm.
so that Peace Corps application was successful. And so just the timing worked out that the same time I was excommunicated, I was going into the Peace Corps shortly after.
Mhm,
So I
mhm.
left the country. I actually left internet access. I left cellular access. I left, for the most part, electricity and running water. So I went into this totally different reality where I had no reminders of this community. I had no reminders of the religion. I was not in a country that had Buddhism as part of their religious landscape.
Right, right.
And so I was just totally removed. And what I did was, I guess, sort of a survival mechanism is I took the route of bury, lock away, cover it up, and just pivot totally on a dime to a
Mhm.
different life. So
Okay.
I put it all away, and it was easy to put away because there's no reminders. And it was so painful that
Yeah.
just to look at it was too much.
Right.
So I had 2 years of living this other reality of not even letting myself remember that's what I had just come from. And, but what I did do while I was in the Peace Corps, the times I did have internet, was I ferociously consumed cult content,
Oh, wow.
not recognizing necessarily like I was in a cult, but I would just watch a cult documentary on repeat. And it felt so good to my brain. I would just watch it and rewatch it and rewatch it. I think I was finding something cathartic. And that
Mhm,
was when I came back from the Peace Corps. I sort of advanced my learning there and I went to the public library and I got all the books on cults and I read everything I could read. And it was the cult community and what sort of how they discussed their experiences that helped me start to realize I was in a cult, which later evolved to a place where I could understand that I experienced abuse, sexual abuse in that
right,
context.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so sometimes people will say to me, I don't know how I am able to know if something I'm in is dangerous or not. And I'll sometimes say, if it's possible, if you can take a step away from a relationship, even say that you have the flu and you have to stay in bed or whatever excuse you can come up with. Because sometimes it breaks a spell, sometimes it gives you perspective, sometimes then it gives you a chance to reconnect inside, but you went far away in every way. And like it was like an emotional, spiritual palate cleanser. Like, let me just do something so different so that when I revisit it, I can really see it. Like from that vantage point that sometimes I talk about like if you want to take a good photo of something, you need to take a step farther away to get the whole
Mhm.
picture, right? The landscape. And so, what a great gift you gave yourself. So, here you had that sense of it, the clarity, and then you reached out for legal help, or what did you do?
Well, and this is again where I just feel really lucky, like a fortunate of circumstance. COVID happened.
Mhm.
And someone who had been in the same cult community I was in had reached out and wanted to see about doing a podcast together during
Mhm.
COVID. We were all doing all sorts of funny hobbies during lockdown. And so Ours was, exploring doing a podcast, and he was a practicing Buddhist at the time of the podcast and was wanting to dive into Buddhism. And we started talking regularly. And I eventually told him the totality of my experience, which isn't something I had done with anyone in that community before. And in telling the totality of my experience, he connected me with someone who's a survivor of sexual abuse from another guru, which wasn't what he told me at the time. He just said, I really think you should talk to this friend I have about your experience, because I think she's experienced the same thing. Maybe you guys could learn something from talking to this person. Then I talked to that person, and that person connected me with Carol.
Wow.
So it was my lawyer. At the time, she was not my lawyer, but more just a friend of the community of Buddhist survivors.
Mm-hmm.
She was the first person to let me know that what I experienced was a crime and that it was a rape, and walked me through the process of making a police report.
My goodness. Woo. Okay. I got goosebumps. I mean, just the shift, having the language, knowing that what happened was illegal also. Really, I'm sure, very different. Like you couldn't then keep finding some spiritual reason for it. Like it shifts things over to, now what do I need to do about this? Were you thinking about trying to get justice? What were you thinking about? What was the motivation for you?
Well, I was thinking that when I started, I was fully anticipating that a lot of time has passed. I don't think what happened to me was good. Now I'm waking up to this idea that it wasn't good. It was also illegal, and there needs to be maybe conversation around it. I was anticipating I would do this police report, and it would result in, years had passed at this point, everyone going, oh my gosh, wow, we didn't realize, Rachel, that's what happened at the time. We were confused. So as a shorthand, I was expecting like a kumbaya kind of experience.
Right? Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
so, so silly. Because
no,
the
it's
connection was,
beautiful.
well,
It's as it should be. It isn't, but it's as it should be. No, I
yeah,
get it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
not what happened.
No.
And, they dug in their heels. They also wrote a really severe, they made a public record. Folks are, of course, welcome to go find it if they're interested, but they wrote this really horrific letter detailing really severe lies about me and myself and my understanding of what had happened. And it really went above and beyond. I mean, like really creative writing style, like painted me as this completely other person, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
I had never seen myself as this, what did they call me? Like I was a shadowy person or something. I was like,
Oh,
wow,
no.
I didn't know I was like,
Well, yeah.
of course, that's totally not true, of course. But, it was the
course.
shock of like, wow, not only is this not a kumbaya moment, but there leverages an opportunity to like fabricate a different reality, which was not what I expected. It made me realize that, well, and I was already in touch with people that saw this from a legal perspective, which is any kind of accountability or awareness wasn't going to be in any way spearheaded or supported by the organization. Like nothing could be done to help them come to a conclusion that we're a nonprofit in the state of Oregon, we're a religious entity, let's practice and model accountability, safe community practices. None of that was going to happen.
Right.
And so now that I had legal connections, the next step became forcing that to happen through pursuing legal actions. So I wasn't coming at it from a perspective of anger or vengeance. At the time, it was just like I felt like I want to just knock on everyone's door, which is what, the person that does the serving does on my behalf, and just say, hey, do you remember this thing that happened, but you're saying didn't happen? Well, we're all going to make sure we all understand that it happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so did you need to face him in court or no?
No,
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't. I did face the board members. They came to my deposition in person, which is maybe a little unusual. So I got to see them for the first time, and that was one of the most healing aspects of the experience. I dreaded it severely, but seeing them in person took like the monster under the bed and brought them into the light for me, and really helped me to see even more of the reality that is the actual reality of the circumstances. So all in all, like the way that it summarized for me was the pursuing legal action was what allowed me to have a mechanism for a type of accountability, and the only type of accountability I had available.
And what happened with the case?
The case settled. So the case came to resolution, which is really another way of saying that it didn't go to a trial environment. So it didn't go to an environment where the facts of the case are brought to a jury of your peers. It was concluded prior to it going to that stage.
Which goes along, I think, with like his, condition, never tell anyone thing. I think he likes to keep things out of the public eye and he doesn't want to be under scrutiny. It doesn't surprise me that it went in that direction. And since that time, just as we're wrapping up, what has it been like for you just to think about that process and move forward? And I'm sure every once in a while, you're busy in your life, and I'm sure there are days go by that it's not on your mind, which is blissful. But there are moments where it does come back. Where do your thoughts take you when you think about it all?
I can't believe I get to say this, but it comes to mind almost never. So my husband and I comment to each other because I think the case wrapped up officially like in February, January. And even by March or April, if you had asked us and we weren't thinking of an answer, how long ago did the case wrap up? We both thought that it was like over a year ago. Because once it reached resolution, it really just dissolved space and time. Really, like it healed it historically. So I felt like all those past instances were all healed and wrapped up all in one culminative event. And when I do think of it now, I think of it, and positive isn't the right word, but it's reflective. It's not, I don't feel it in my body in the way that it would take hold of me before. I really just feel, and frankly, actually, what I think about the most when it does come up is I'm reminded of the people that are still there and that are not, that are in the state that I remember myself in and how unfortunate that state is. And I just send a little thought that I hope that's not their permanent life story, or that's not always going to be their future. And that's really the only lingering sadness in it, is knowing that some grief will never dissipate. And for me, that's the grief, is not having those connections and knowing what those people are who I care about are in.
Right. Right. That's a very human toll, that there are people still there and there are people stuck in that and being treated potentially in similar ways, and have a lot to get through to get to where you are, I think, to really feel free, to be free. Part of what happens with so many people I've worked with where there wasn't representation, where the law wasn't up to speed, and there's still so much room for growth and forward momentum in terms of understanding this legally and people really getting this, in terms of the law in the United States and law in some other countries. There are some countries actually that are more forward thinking when it comes to coercion and other things than the US. So we really do have a lot of room to grow here. But there is something so interesting about what you said. I talked to so many people who have this unfinished story and it lingers because of it. And they didn't get either justice, or they didn't get their day in court, or they didn't get a payout, or they didn't get just this moment where someone had to take responsibility and had to say, okay, here, this is what you get to have because of what was done to you. And that it does help to put it aside. It does help to put it away. And so for all the people out there who still have this wound that's open, and the story is just still in the middle, and they might not get resolution. I do feel for them and how they carry that around. And I'm very happy for you that you've gotten to be able to have so much of your life now be just about present time and enjoying, your partner and your cat and your garden and everything else, because you deserve that. You've been through quite a lot. So it is really lovely to talk to you, and I'm so happy for you to be able to share your story and to share your happiness now after all that you've been through. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, Rachel.